welcome and Healthy Chats with the Docs with Dr. Brooke Leverone. Today we're going to talk about the microbiome. That's a kind of a fancy word, Doc, for gut, right? Gut health or whatever.
Yeah, my fancy word for bugs in our gut.
Bugs in our gut, yeah. So let's talk, explain to me and everybody who's not a doctor, what is the microbiome?
Right. So the microbiome refers to the bacteria and fungus and living organisms that exist inside of our intestines. And they have a symbiotic relationship with us, which means that we feed them just like when we're eating our food and we feed ourselves, they get to eat some of those food bits too. So they have a healthy, safe, warm environment with food supply. And in return, they do a lot of things for us as well too. This compilation of all of these bacteria and species in our gastrointestinal system makes up the microbiome and is an integral component to gut health and overall wellness.
So I have this funky vision of all these little bugs in my gut,
right.
and they're in the kitchen eating.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, they're very microscopic. These are bacteria essentially, and we have bacteria everywhere. There's bacteria on our skin. There's bacteria in our eyes and our ears and our mouth. We aren't a sterile being. We are a biological being that lives one with the earth, and we are part of all of that comes with that, which includes this bacteria that does symbiotically work with us. And when things are balanced, that's a good relationship. But when things aren't balanced, that can be a bad relationship. Like if you've ever had Montezuma's Revenge going to Mexico, that would be the bacteria we don't want in our gut.
Okay, so there's good bacteria and bad bacteria, or good bugs and bad bugs?
Yes. So the healthy microbiome consists of thousands of different species, which is a lot. I mean, think about it. There's thousands of different types of bacteria that exist in our intestines and on our body at any given point in time. Most of these ideally are healthy gut bacteria that will support digestion of food and function of other areas of our body. And we have, these thousands of different bacteria. There's about a trillion of these bacteria living in and amongst us. I mean, and think about bacteria microscopic, right? So they're very small, but yes, we have all these bacteria that live within us and help us function every day.
So we're not alone.
Right. Right. Yeah, we're not alone.
Yeah. So what I got is my gut is home to millions of bugs.
Trillions of bugs.
Trillions with a T. Oh my God.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Well, that's quite an image. So I oftentimes hear the microbiome tied to your genome or genetics. Why does the microbiome, if there are a bunch of bugs in my gut, have anything to do with my genetics?
Well, that's still an area that's sort of being researched a little, but essentially we know that and there's different components to it. So your DNA will dictate the type of bacteria that you're going to support from birth. And then you also get bacteria from mom, who we come from. We get her bacteria too. And then the environment and your diet also contributes to your gut bacteria. Then over your lifetime, there can be certain genetic variances that can lead you to maybe overgrowth of bad bacteria and not having a good bacterial balance. And then there's a lot of other components that promote a healthy microbiome as well too. So there is an underlying component to your genetics that contributes to your microbiome and the type of bacteria that is going to live within your gut system.
Right. So that makes sense. Obviously, I understand a little bit, enough to be dangerous actually about that.
Right.
So let's talk a little bit about, gut, diet. So we have trillions of these bugs in our gut. Okay, I love that image. And we're feeding these bugs.
Yep.
So obviously our diet has a lot to do with our microbiome bugs because we're
Yes.
feeding them. So
Right.
how does that work?
So the healthy bacteria, so, this sort of ties into the good and the bad bacteria. So there are, there's thousands of species that we know of that are part of our healthy microbiome, and a lot of which we've heard of, and like the lactobacillus and bifidobacter and Saccharomyces. You pick up any probiotic supplement in the store and you'll see those listed there, but there's thousands more. And they depend on a healthy diet to thrive. So lots of fiber is really good for these healthy bacteria and to help them thrive. They feed off fiber. And why that's important is because when we are talking about digestive health, we have enzymes to break down proteins and fats and certain carbohydrates, but the bacteria is actually what's processing most of our fibers and our plant fibers for us. So if we are eating certain foods and maybe getting a little bloated from them, it can be related to the fact that you don't have a healthy microbiome to process those foods for you, and thus you're getting digestive upset. So we need this is that symbiotic relationship. We need that microbiome in order to be able to properly digest foods so that we can get the nutrients from those foods, and so we don't have an upset stomach. And then in turn, those fibrous foods feed them and then they thrive and survive. And the one thing that we have found that's really, really important to maintaining that healthy microbiome is not just the fiber in the diet, but also the diversity of the food that you're eating. So a more diverse diet, this can tie into discussions about eating seasonally and eating, the different fruits and vegetables that come in at different types of the year. Having that diversity of diet has also been shown to then provide different fiber and nutrient sources to feed these different bacteria, and thus increase the diversity of these bacteria as well too. And having a really diverse bacterial balance in your gut is also really, really important for the balance of the microbiome. So it's not just lactobacillus and bifidobacter, like those are two species, right? And I'm telling you, there are thousands of species. And we have found that a healthy gut microbiome is one that has a very diverse microbiome. So then therefore eating lots of different foods will help with that. And then on the flip side, we know that eating our processed, packaged, fried foods, our preservatives, our food colorings, our artificial flavoring, all of those things we also know are stressful and damaging to our microbiome and can actually destroy some of that healthy bacteria. Chronic stress also will destroy healthy bacteria as well too. So your diet and lifestyle has a direct impact on that healthy microbiome. And it's really, you are what you eat. We talk about this all the time, right? And your microbiome is also what you eat, and your microbiome is also quintessential into how you are functioning every day.
Well, now I'm starting to understand why naturopaths always say food is medicine. So
right. Yeah. So many. Yeah.
So, yeah. So now I'm going back to your vision of the factory, right? And now
okay.
I'm visioning, now I'm opening a door and there are trillions of these bugs that I'm feeding.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Now there's all these bugs in the factory. I haven't thought about the microbiome in the factory, but I would say that the microbiome in the factory is probably holding all the walls together and cleaning up the trash that's left on the floor.
Yeah, so they're like carp at the bottom of the ocean or something, right?
Right.
Like,
yeah.
the bottom feeders going around.
Right.
They're the
yes.
cleaning
They
crew.
all
They
have,
come
they
out
all
at
have
midnight.
a purpose. Yeah.
Okay, so we're just thinking about this. I mean, it's hard to wrap your head around. There are trillions of bugs in my gut that make up my microbiome. So I think it was you who told me, like, if you laid out, everything in your microbiome, it would cover a tremendous amount of space. So explain that for a little bit.
Yes. So in our gut, so we have, it's not just a tube, right? It's not just like the pipe from under your sink in the bathroom, right? It has all these folds in it, and each of these little folds have all these what are called villi, have these little fingers on them, and each of those fingers have little fingers on them. So there's tons and tons of surface area. So the amount of surface area that actually covers your entire intestinal tract. If you were to lay out if you were to like unfold all the fingers and all the fingers and flatten them all out and flatten out all the ruffles, or, rugae is what we call it, in the intestine, so that everything was flattened out, that would cover the same surface area as an entire tennis court. So think of like a giant, like a whole tennis, like, think it like you could lay in the middle of the tennis court and take up like nothing, right? But you undo your intestines, and that's going to cover the entire tennis court. And then now think of that in tennis court, and you cannot see a single speck of green on that tennis court because it's completely covered with all of those bacteria. So that's how much surface area and that's how much bacteria lives in in a healthy gastrointestinal system. So now some people, there may be some gaps on that tennis court, right? Because there may be some areas where, so you can there are things like we always think bacteria is bad, right? Because it's like, oh, we have a bacterial infection, we need to take antibiotics. Like, oh, we got a bug, we have to take antibiotics, right? And that's not true, but we do also need the bacteria. So yes, if you go camping or to another country, or you go to a restaurant here in the States that, something got contaminated, and it's a bacteria that your body doesn't like, obviously E. coli is the big one that we think about there, but there's also like Klebsiella and some other ones that can come into your intestines and make you sick. And that's where you get, that really unpleasant food poisoning that most of us have experienced at some point. You don't need me to explain the details. You know what I'm talking about. And that will also kind of wipe out a lot of your healthy bacteria. And then if you do get an infection that you need antibiotics, sometimes you need antibiotics to treat the gut infection. Sometimes you need antibiotics for a wound infection or UTI. Sometimes we do need them, unfortunately. Unfortunately, though, a single round of antibiotics has been shown to wipe out the entire gut flora, and replacing that gut flora with probiotics for 2 years only gives you partial restoration of your original microbiome. So think about that. One round of antibiotics, it takes 2 years with replacement bacteria to even get close to where you were before. And so now if you have that tennis court and you've got gaps in the floor of the tennis court, that's areas where other bacteria will say, oh, look, there's a spot for me there. And maybe it's bacteria that you don't want. And then now you can get overgrowth of maybe bacteria that's not necessarily pathologic, that causes acute symptoms, but that causes disruption in what's happening and will cause, make everybody else on the tennis court very upset. And then now you have some other issues going on, right? And there's, there's lots of, so poor diet, any history of antibiotics, I mean, we've all had to take antibiotics at some point in our life. Any history of antibiotics and poor diet can create the gaps in the microbiome, which can then allow for other unwanted bacteria to find a landing pad, and then they battle it out with your bacteria, and that can cause disruption in function, and which can be a contributing factor to, things like IBS.
So let's just summarize that again, because we did have a question. It was perfect timing. The question was, how much do antibiotics affect the microbiome?
Oh, yeah.
So you were literally talking about it when the question came in.
Yeah. So hopefully it was clear. It wipes it out completely, and with replacement, it still takes at least 2 years.
Okay, so let's just say that again. So let me repeat it to make sure I hear this right. So 1 dose of antibiotics will wipe out your microbiome for 2 years?
Yes, 1 round of antibiotics will completely wipe out your microbiome, and it can take 2 years of replacing those healthy bacteria with probiotics to start to see a difference in getting close to where you were before.
Wow, that's wild. And so I also heard that a lot of people who know that antibiotics affect your microbiome start taking probiotics while they're taking antibiotics. So let's start talking about how you build that up. That's not a good thing to do, right? You need to wait till the antibiotics are done, or should you start?
What I recommend, depending on how frequently you're taking the antibiotics. So what I recommend is that I would say there's still some debate about this in the community, but most of us agree that you can take probiotics while taking an antibiotic, but you have to take them separately from each other. Because if you're taking an antibiotic and a probiotic at the same time, the antibiotic's just going to kill what you're taking and maybe not have enough strength left to kill what it's actually trying to fight. So if you take an antibiotic in the morning, you can take your probiotic in the evening. Or if you take an antibiotic in the morning and the evening, you can take your probiotic in the middle of the day. And then what I do is when they're done, I do 100 billion units of probiotics for a month after that to try and replenish their microbiome, which is a pretty, I mean, and we save the 100 billion for that reason. So you want to, so you can take this. So the take home here is you can take probiotics with antibiotics in almost all cases. The trick is you have to take it during a separate time of the day. They need to be separated by a few hours when you're taking them. So that may only mean, you know, you're getting one dose in the middle of the day, potentially. If you're taking an antibiotic that needs to be 3 or 4 times a day, you may not be able to squeeze in the antibiotic at that, or the probiotic in between those doses. Either way, you want to replenish afterwards with healthy, with a good hefty dose of probiotics. And I use the 100 billion doses to replenish my patients. You can, if you can't get the probiotics in while you're taking the antibiotics, you can focus your diet on the rich fiber foods, the diverse foods. Fermented foods are actually also a really great source of healthy bacteria. Even a kombucha has a couple billion units of bacteria in there, which is pretty decent. So the healthy bacteria is not just, so, you know, we were talking about there's thousands of species, but there's only so many species we can buy in a probiotic supplement. So you can maximize this so you can make up for that by eating your fermented foods. Kombucha, like I said, couple billion in kombucha. Sauerkraut, kimchi. Yep, those are great sources of healthy bacteria. And I'm talking like the real fermented stuff, not the stuff you get in the jar on the shelf, but the real stuff that's in the cold section, which also includes those raw fermented vegetables as well, too, that you can get in the cooler section at some of your health food stores. These are excellent ways to get more diversity in your healthy microbiome and support that flora species that exist there outside of taking a probiotic. So if you're taking antibiotics and can't get in a probiotic, you can certainly eat your probiotics and get them from these food sources as well, too. So that's another way to do that. And a quick note, yogurt is not a good source of probiotics unless you're making it at home by yourself. The reason is dairy isn't good for most of us to begin with. Second, there's a ton of sugar even in your unflavored yogurts because milk has lactose, which is very sugary, and it's going to be sugar in there. And thirdly, any commercially available any commercially available yogurt is pasteurized, which means they've killed all the bacteria. So Dannon yogurt actually got in trouble a few years ago because they were marketing the Activa or whatever, all the bacteria, and they got in trouble because there wasn't actually any live bacteria in their yogurt. So there was a huge lawsuit about that. So yogurt is not, I repeat, yogurt is not a good source of bacteria. Everyone's like, but I eat yogurt. I'm like, no, that's not it. So the yogurt is not a good source. If you make it at home, like if you have there's ways you can make it at home. You can get yogurt starters. You can get your own milk alternative, and you can put the bacteria in there and ferment it, and you can make it at home and get the bacteria, but not the commercially available one. So you want to use other sources.
Yeah, that's true. I know we've talked about probiotics, separately, but I speaking of that, I do know that some people do put good probiotics in yogurt, and it does grow.
Right. Yes. You can add probiotics to your yogurt and make it ferment, as well too. But you can't just go and buy yogurt off the shelf and be like, I'm getting my probiotics. It just it's a myth. It doesn't work.
Yeah, I know. It's kind of fun, for someone who's been in healthcare my whole career, and now everybody's like on the health bandwagon. And so everything's just kind of marketing. And so it makes it really hard for a consumer
Yeah.
to know what's real and what's not, right?
I know. And that's why I really was trying to hammer that point home for you guys, because I know the marketing is in the media and it's ingrained. They did such a
Yeah,
good job that it's ingrained in all of our brains that
yeah,
yogurt's the
yeah,
way to go. But it's just, unfortunately, that's not true.
yeah. Well, we're running out of time, but I did want to talk. A lot of people ask
Gosh,
about
yeah.
these direct to consumer microbiome tests. I mean, they
Right.
do, speaking of marketing,
Right.
lots of marketing there. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then everybody remembers Biome got in trouble for their testing or for their Medicaid billing or something. So the
Oh, yeah.
microbiome testing's been in the news. But why? I kind of look at it like ancestry or recreational genomics. It's really cool and fun to figure out where you're from, but they really shouldn't be used for healthcare. So kind of take that analogy for microbiome testing. It might be fun, but what do you do with the
Right.
results and et cetera, et
So,
cetera.
okay, so kind of like we were talking about the tennis court and there being these holes on the tennis court where other bacteria can live. And if that bacteria is not supposed to be there, they're going to fight with your bacteria and they may actually damage that area of the tennis court, which means that it's not going to be good to play on anymore, right?
Mhm.
So, abnormal bacteria balance in the gut is one of the common causes of things like IBS, and heartburn as well too, and gas and bloating. So a lot of our GI symptoms can be related simply to an imbalance in our microbiome. Therefore, I do find looking at the microbiome a helpful tool as a practitioner to be able to understand what's going on. That's going to be different in some ways though than some of these direct to consumer microbiome tests. The reason is these direct to consumer microbiome tests will do a DNA test and say there's all these different bacteria in your gut that exist. But it it then what? Then you go buy a probiotic or you buy their specialty product that they're marketing that they say is going to fix all of your problems, but it doesn't really I mean, God, I'm pausing because there's so many issues about these direct to consumer tests. I'm trying to stay focused on which one I'm talking about. I'd say the biggest issue for me with these direct to consumer marketing tests is that they're really expensive and I think they're overpriced. Two, they don't, basically at the end of the day, it's not giving you any practical information to be able to do anything about your health outside of them marketing you their supplements. And then, of course, you always have to check on what type of lab techniques that they're using and is this actually valid data. So, when in my practice, what me and a lot of my colleagues do is we use other tests from some of the labs that we know and trust that will look at the microbiome using a couple different testing techniques so that we can confirm the presence of certain bacteria and other bacteria. And then we can also see if there is parasites, if there is how your healthy bacteria is functioning. Are you making what are called short chain fatty acids? Are you digesting your food appropriately? Are you secreting digestive enzymes? What kind of inflammation do you have in the bacteria? So there's a lot more data that's a lot more useful in assessing the whole picture. So remember last week we talked about how it's really important to address all the different areas of normal gut function in order to understand dysfunction and to restore balance, which includes
Right.
the healthy digestive enzymes, healthy motor neuron complex, healthy microbiome, and good integrity of lining. These microbiome tests that you can get from direct to consumer just don't, they only cover a small part of that and they
Yeah.
don't provide a lot of answers to be able to manage that. And I think they're overpriced for what you're paying. I just do.
Yeah. I mean,
They
the
can be
microbiome
fun.
is super complex, right? I mean, we're talking
Yeah.
about woo, and it
Yeah.
changes and
And
it's
it's just so
dynamic.
much more complicated
Yeah.
both in research and in clinical practice than what you're getting from just that.
Yeah, no, I mean, we are complex beings. So, hey, we do have a question before we end from YouTube. The question was, are some probiotic strains better than others?
Ooh, that's such a good question. Um, No, because there's not one specific strain that's going to be better than any other strain. And at the end of the day, the most important thing that we find is the diversity. You want to have lots of different strains, which is why getting it from food sources can be really helpful, both in what you're feeding the bacteria with a diverse diet and consuming those fermented foods. And so when we buy probiotics over the counter, the challenge is that we can only get certain ones like lactobacillus, bifidobacter, Saccharomyces. Some companies like Garden of Life will have a lot of different strains in them that you can utilize, but not thousands, right? And we also found through research that there is certain strains are associated with certain conditions. Like there's certain strains associated with IBS, with IBD, with diabetes, with cardiovascular disease, with obesity. So we are seeing patterns in certain strains, but nothing that's like, oh, so if you take this strain, you're going to fix your obesity. It's unfortunately not that simple. Or this strain, you're going to fix your diabetes. It's not that simple. Really, the most important thing, and this is the most important thing, is the diversity. You want to have lots of diversity in the healthy bacteria. Again, healthy diet, fermented foods, supplementing with probiotics to mix it up, and avoiding your fried, processed, packaged food coloring, stress management, all those things.
Yeah, and I know it's in working with one of the large health systems, we were educating them on professional versus OTC and probiotics.
Yeah, well, because we have that whole talk on probiotics. So if you
Yeah.
want to add even more information, you can go back and look at some of our previous videos because we have a whole talk on probiotics.
Yeah, that 1 versus 60. I mean, it's just like for someone
Yeah.
who's a layperson, it's like, oh, I could take one over the counter, the ones that doctors recommend the most, or I mean, I could take 60 of those or one professional supplement. So it's like,
Right.
I get it. 1 versus
Yeah.
60.
Yeah. It's worth it's worth a few extra pennies. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, it's a lot cheaper if you do it the right
Well,
way.
yeah, if you break it in the moment, it seems like it's expensive, but really for what you're getting, yeah.
Yeah. Well, doctor, we went over again, but
That's such a hard one not to, yeah.
I don't know if I'll sleep well tonight, knowing I have trillions of bugs in my gut that are bigger than a tennis court.
Sorry, they've been with you this whole time. Just don't think about
it. No. Well, when you know it now, you can't get it out of your mind. So. All right, doc. Take care. Have a wonderful day. Talk to you next week.
All right. Thanks so much, guys.